Michael, thank you so much for joining us this morning. So part of the focus here with the summit is going to be, it has been on Iran. Now, there is a memorandum of understanding between the United States and Iran, and when a deal is expected to be signed on Friday. Is there optimism among the leaders there, other world leaders there at the G7 summit, that this can be signed and there can be an understanding there between Iran?
I think that there is hope that in the short term that there can be some relief from the pressure economically in much of the world, or in fact, the whole world, in terms of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And so that I actually think that this deal, even if it doesn't necessarily last very long, could provide the short-term relief economically that Europe and Asia and even the United States needs, from cutting off virtually 20% of the world's oil supply, as well as chemicals, helium, et cetera.
And can you speak to the what that impact was like for these European countries with that closure of the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, from Qatar, they were very dependent on natural gas, especially since they don't want to obviously import it anymore from Russia. So you have the LNG coming from Qatar, very dependent on oil. A lot of the jet fuel that the European airliners depend on are actually refined in the Gulf. That was cut off. So they were facing a great deal of pressure, much greater than the United States. And you also see that in East Asia. And I think that the risk to the global economy, which would affect the United States, of course, as well, was growing. And so if they can get the Strait of Hormuz open, I think it's very important for the Europeans, for many countries' economies, including our own.
And as well, could this help mend relations with other leaders as well? As AP reports that relations with India have been choppy with the United States because of the Iran war.
Well, you also see this with Russia. Russia, and before that, the Soviet Union was closely aligned with India. In fact, of course, during the Cold War against the United States, so the Indians during the Cold War were basically aligned effectively against us. Under the Nixon administration, they actually got the Chinese to break away from the Soviet orbit. So we had ironic situation where the Indians, a democracy, were more aligned with the Soviet Union, and China, still communist dictatorship, somewhat aligned against the Soviet Union. That relationship between India and Russia hasn't completely ended. India still imports arms from Russia, and they get cheap oil from Russia, unfortunately, despite their aggression against Ukraine, the threats that Russia is making against Europe, and Russia's support of Iran, which is still, or has been, the largest state sponsor of terrorism since the 1980s.
And when it comes to this potential deal on Friday between the United States and Iran, there are a lot of other factors that could possibly play into this. And I wanted to bring up this ex post here from Fox News with what President Trump said yesterday as he publicly rebukes Israel over its war against Hezbollah, saying, quote, Israel's fighting Hezbollah too long and too many people are being killed. Trump said he opposed strikes that destroy apartment buildings filled with civilians and revealed he urged Israel to let Syria take the lead against Hezbollah instead. Quote, if Israel can't do the job without killing everyone else, he'll do the job. Syria will do the job. And when it comes to things like this and Israel's strikes on Hezbollah targets over in Lebanon, could this potentially let the deal fall through on Friday if those strikes were to continue?
Well, we first have to understand what Hezbollah is. It's the terrorist vanguard of Iran. They're Lebanese Shiites, but they effectively are a puppet of the Iranian government. They murdered nearly 300 U.S. Marines in the early 80s who were serving as peacekeepers. They were the key vanguard of Iranian-backed terrorists in Iraq that trained Iraqi Shiites and Shiites from other countries to murder hundreds, if not more than 1,000 American soldiers in Iraq. So Hezbollah is very much a terrorist organization. It, like its masters in Iran, are devoted to the destruction of Israel and to some extent the destruction of the United States. So it is like I said, devoted to Israel's destruction. So Israel's concern is understandable. Hezbollah is a terrorist organization who had one of its leaders, probably Imad Mugniya, murder with his own hands, the CIA station chief in Beirut in the early 80s. Hezbollah and Iran may have been behind the bombing of the Pan Am flight over Lockerbie, Scotland, for example. So long list of terrorism. Hezbollah does not want a peace deal. It's very badly weakened. It used to serve to help perpetuate the occupation of Lebanon under the Assad dynasty. That's fortunately gone. Basically, while the Alawites in Syria, to explain what's going on in Syria, were a minority that oppressed the rest of the people, what we now have is the majority is Sunni Arab. And the fact that there wasn't a representative government in Syria was bad. It was hostile to the United States, always aligned with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. That has changed, and that is good. And Israel actually played a key role and the United States in toppling the evil Assad Ba'athist government in Syria. That's been only a development in the last few years. The problem with this leader of Syria, as you know, is he spent time in ISIS. Now, those who say that he's ISIS and don't acknowledge the fact that he appears to have changed are ignoring the reality. But we can't trust him to work in Lebanon. Lebanon is divided ethnically and religiously. It's not realistic. Lebanese, who are very much opposed to Hezbollah, Iran, very much support the United States, do not agree or accept the idea of Syria going in. They're hoping that this new Syrian leader is able to bring together Syrian people together and end what had been a civil war. But that's not a really practical solution. It's surprising that President Trump would suggest Syria going in. The Israeli military is far more advanced. The fact that President Trump is disappointed about civilian casualties in Lebanon is understandable. And, you know, it's a difficult situation. Obviously, we want to end the war in Iran, and opening the Strait of Hormuz is a good thing. But the Syrian military is very, very unlikely to serve as an alternative to the Israeli military in Lebanon.
And then I also wanted to talk about the other discussions as well that is happening at the G7 summit, especially when it comes to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. According to a French diplomat familiar with the talks, G7 leaders, including President Trump, agreed to increase pressure on Russia, notably through sanctions targeting its oil and natural gas sectors. Can you break down what this could potentially look like and how this could set back Russia in their invasion of Ukraine?
Well, Russia gained some relief on sanctions from the Trump administration in the midst of the Iran war. President Trump is suggesting that he can reapply the sanctions, given that the Strait of Hormuz hopefully will be opened. This is a smart move. This Russian government led by Putin is basically a return to hardline Soviet policies, despite the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed. The Soviet Union effectively lost the Cold War. We need to be unified as the West, as the free world, to defend against dictatorships like Russia and China and support our allies in countries like Ukraine, Taiwan, and furthermore, also other countries that could face threats, the rest of Europe, Japan, South Korea, and Australia at this point. You have a growing alignment between two major dictatorships, Russia and China. China has the second largest economy, and Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal, Chinese major military buildup, and the Chinese are in the midst of an unprecedented nuclear buildup. The significance is in the last few years, increasingly, we're facing two nuclear superpowers. 10 years ago, we were only facing one nuclear superpower, and that was Russia. Now we're increasingly facing two, because China used to depend on a minimum nuclear deterrent, and they've changed tacks, unfortunately, and now they're seeking parity with Russia and the United States. That puts our military in a very difficult situation of facing two nuclear superpowers. This is new. This was not the case 10 years ago. It's now the case. The Russians are helping the Chinese in this. and we have to stay together with our allies, or else the free world will be very dangerously weakened. Putin does not intend to stop in Ukraine, and his confrontation is with the entire Western world, including the United States, the leader of the free world.
And when we talk about Russia not stopping right now, and really the focus these last few months have really been on the Iran conflict, especially here in the United States. We didn't hear too much about Russia, Ukraine, as we know that just in this past several weeks, Russia launched some very aggressive attacks on Ukraine. Where is the conflict at now? Is Russia occupying large portions of Ukraine?
Well, what has happened over the last few years is at first, many experts thought the Ukrainians couldn't hold up against Russia. They were proven very wrong. Ukraine got very significant support from the United States and Europe together. Putin horribly miscalculated from the very beginning. He thought Ukraine wasn't a real country. He thought Zelensky being a comedian was a joke. What he actually did is attacked the second largest country in Europe and the one with the second largest military in Europe, meaning that Ukraine has about 700,000 troops. So he badly underestimated it. The Russian forces packed their dress uniforms. They thought they were going to parade in Kiev. They tried to march 1,000 miles in some cases, overextended supply lines. Of course, this war has been going on for a long time now. But, for example, the U.S. very successfully detected the preparations for the war. They warned the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians were able to move key assets. Russian cruise missiles were not able to take out the anti-aircraft missiles. The United States, and more so the Europeans in the last year, have given massive support, but especially the United States initially. The Ukrainians have become world leaders in drones. They have shown the world how far you can go with drones. At this point, no country has mastered drone warfare more than Ukraine. The Russians are doing very badly. They're taking enormous losses, and the Ukrainians can increasingly strike deep into Russia with very painful blows with drones. The speculation is that Putin will want to respond. They're not making good traction in Ukraine. One possibility is he attacks, probably not enormous attack, but he attacks another NATO country. It could be Lithuania, it could be Estonia, it could be Latvia, move his forces in to try to expose the weakness of NATO and try to call America's bluff in defending NATO. Just in the past few days, a Russian naval vessel in the English Channel started to fire warning shots at a British civilian ship. It was not aimed at the ship, but it was the first time in 100 years that a Russian naval ship opened fire in the English Channel. What they call warning bullets, but very concerning. You see a lot of threatening Russian activity in the British Channel, for example. The British BBC has reported in the last week that they believe attempted arson against places where the British Prime Minister was residing is linked back to Russian intelligence. You see Russian operations, attempted assassinations in Germany, and you see nuclear preparations on the part of Russia. So Russia may escalate by attacking somehow another European country, even though it is very much bogged down in Ukraine, and the possibility is very real that in at least a very limited sense that the Russians may use nuclear strikes. American intelligence at the end of 2022 thought that there was about a 50-50 chance that the Russians were about to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Thank God they didn't. The United States acted very aggressively to deter that. That has not gone away. Putin and this very reactionary Soviet-style thuggish government of Russia is very much a wounded bear that is cornered. It is dangerous, but the Ukrainians are fighting very well. They're getting a lot of support from the Europeans. As the U.S. has reduced support, the Europeans have increased it, and the Ukrainians have fought very, very bravely.
And then I do want to touch on that support from Europeans as well. It says Ukraine on Monday officially started European Union membership negotiations. Ukraine sees EU membership as a security guarantee for a stable future. Once the war ends, its best guarantee would be membership in the NATO military alliance here, according to this article off the AP News. But the Trump administration insists that can't happen, and others are wary of Ukraine joining while the war continues, according to this article here from the Associated Press. Why are some hesitant to join while the conflict is ongoing?
Well, that could put NATO and the US at war with Russia. But if you watch Russian state television, they already view themselves at war with Europe. They sometimes focus on the British, sometimes they focus on the United States. Um, I think in some ways, Zelensky is the Churchill of our time. He stood up against one of the most evil government very much behind Iran to some extent, and a government devoted to toppling the US-led world order that's prevailed since the end of World War II. Um, I would say that a lot of people are underestimating the potential damage that the Trump administration in alliance with Israel has inflicted on the Iranian regime. I am not convinced at all that this Iranian regime will last. I think the Chinese and Russians have seen, once again, the ability of the US military to project power. I will say that. A weak point of Trump, President Trump, in both administrations is to be too friendly, too sympathetic to Putin, who is still at core a hardline KGB. That is his ideology. He's devoted to destruction of the West. Part of American prosperity has come from leading the free world since the defeat of the Nazis in Imperial Japan, and we need to be tough on that. But there is a dilemma that we've seen in multiple presidential administrations with increasing Russian aggression, in the Bush administration with invasion of Georgia, in the Obama administration with the illegal seizure of Crimea, with the Biden administration with this more massive invasion, and both Trump terms, that we are trying to balance defending allies and friendly countries that are not in NATO with preventing an out of control escalation with Russia, which had been the only country that can destroy the United States. I think, unfortunately, the Chinese are starting to catch up with them. So we're trying to manage the escalation despite differences and rhetorical divides between the Trump and Biden administration. There is a certain amount of continuity here. I will just briefly, switching back to Iran, point out in the very first year of the Biden administration was bombing Iranian-backed terrorists in Syria and Iraq. The war against Iran, or the Iranian war, I should say, against the United States is really 47 years old. And we do see continuity. I think there's always been concern among experts in the national security circles of whether President Trump fully addresses the fact that Putin is a very hardcore enemy of the West and the United States. And it's something that we can't run away from. And the Russians, with their nuclear arsenal, poses a great danger. I would say, if anything, the Ukrainians are now winning the war, but it is very difficult. And we have a cornered bear, that being Russia, led by Putin, and they have 5,000, 6,000 nuclear weapons. So it's a very precarious situation. If we show weakness, then it is very dangerous because it invites further Russian aggression. And so we need to be tough. We need to be careful. We don't want to escalate in a way that could lead to a dangerous escalation. It is very comparable to other critical situations back in the original Cold War. The nuclear weapons didn't magically go away. On the plus side, I think that a lot of people are underestimating the possibility that this Iranian government will at least collapse. We've seen a story before with brutal repression by Bashar Assad, murdering his own people, and before that, Gaddafi. And neither of them survived. So I think that's what we can hope for. And the Ukrainians have been very, very courageous and very, very tough in their fight against Russia. And they have fought the fight for the rest of Europe and for the United States. And they have borne the brunt of the war. And it's tragic for them, but we should be very thankful that they have fought so fiercely against the most determined enemy of the United States, which is this KGB thug, Putin.
Michael Szanto, thank you so much for hopping on this morning. We really appreciate it. Really great to get your insights and helping break this all down for us.
You're very welcome. Have a great morning.